G'day YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Ready to continue with part 2 of the book reading of The Scarlet Plague, written in 1913 by Jack London, set in the year 2073. Looking back to 2013, a time when, according to Jack London, there were 8 billion people on the world, and the human population was struck by the Scarlet Plague. So the narrator in the story is old Professor Smith. He's 87 years old. When the plague struck, he was 27, and he's trying to explain things to his grandsons. So, directly we will dive into the omnibus of science fiction to take up the story. Well, I thought it was going to be halfway in, but it's more like 1/3 the way in, so this is going to be a bit of a long one. I propose we keep track of the time using this Capuchin Sundial, carefully constructed so that it will tell the time anywhere 30 degrees south of the equator. First, we set the baseboard up, aligned with the meridian from the North Pole to the South Pole, passing through this tree stump. Then we set the anchor point of the string along the calendar slot, running January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, and here we are, the 10th of August, September, October, November, December. With the string telling straight down across the parallel hour lines of the dial, what it will tell us there is sunrise time at about 7 minutes to 7 in the morning, and 7 minutes past 5 in the afternoon you've got your sunset time. In order to tell what time it is now, we take the string, we lay it over the top of the 12 at the point of the Capuchin monk's cowl, and we set the little time-telling bead onto the string. And now, we'll get on to the equation of time a little bit later. Now, we open the window. We rotate so that we can see the shadow of the window. We then rotate the quadrant until we see the window casting a sunbeam along that alignment line. Okay, so you can see the sunbeam on the alignment line. You can also see the bead is on the 12 o'clock. When we come down here, we see the azimuth says that it is midday. And we see that the solar lithium titanium battery powered chronometer says that it is 11 minutes. 11 minutes to midday. Why the difference? Well, the difference is because here we're 130 miles to the east of Moree, and Moree is where the centre of the standard time zone is measured from. So on the one hand, I'm running about 12 minutes ahead of zone standard time. On the other hand, as we see here, according to the equation of time, here in August, the dial should be running about 5 minutes slow due to the obliquity of the ecliptic. So the fact that the Capuchin bead as well as the azimuth indicator both give us midday, 11 minutes ahead of when it should be giving us midday. This just pretty much shows the limits of building a sundial out of chainsaw milled wood. It's pretty good, but it's perhaps not perfect. Right, it ought to be good enough for a book reading. As you can see, the pendulum even has the sun and the moon, the moon and the earth orbiting each other, as both of them orbit the sun. Pretty pleased with that little bit of woodwork, graphic design. I think it's about 23 years old, actually. Okay, one of the grandkids is consoling the old bloke after having been barked at by another one of the grandkids. Grandsa, Harelip announced, "You make me sick with your gabble. Why don't you tell about the Red Death? If you ain't going to, say so, and we'll start back for camp." The old man looked at him and silently began to cry. The weak tears of age rolled down his cheeks, and all the feebleness of his 87 years showed in his grief-stricken countenance. "Sit down," Edwin counselled soothingly. "Grandsa's all right. He's just getting to the Scarlet Death, ain't you, Grandsa? He's just going to tell us about it right now. Sit down, Harelip. Go ahead, Grandsa." The old man wiped the tears away on his grimy knuckles and took up the tale in a tremulous, piping voice that soon strengthened as he got the swing of the narrative. "It was in the summer of 2013 that the plague came. I was 27 years old, and well do I remember it. Wireless dispatches—" Harelip spat loudly his disgust, and Grandsa hastened to make amends. "We talked through the air in those days, thousands and thousands of miles, and the word came of a strange disease that had broken out in New York City. There were 17 millions of people living then in that noblest city of America. Nobody thought anything about the news. It was only a small thing. There had only been a few deaths. It seemed, though, that they had died very quickly, and that one of the first signs of the disease was the turning red of the face and all the body. Within 24 hours came the report of the first case in Chicago, and on the same day it was made public that London, the greatest city in the world next to Chicago, had been secretly fighting the plague for 2 weeks and censoring the news dispatches. That is, not permitting the word to go forth to the rest of the world that London had the plague. It looked serious, but we in California, like everywhere else, were not alarmed. We were sure that the bacteriologists would find a way to overcome this new germ, just as they had overcome other germs in the past. But the trouble was the astonishing quickness with which this germ destroyed human beings, and the fact that it inevitably killed any human body it entered. No one ever recovered. There was the old Asiatic cholera, when you might eat dinner with a well man in the evening, and the next morning, if you got up early enough, you would see him being hauled by your window in the death cart. But this new plague was quicker than that, much quicker. From the moment of the first signs of it, a man would be dead in an hour. Some lasted for several hours. Many died within 10 or 15 minutes of the appearance of the first signs. The heart began to beat faster, and the heat of the body to increase. Then came the scarlet rash, spreading like wildfire over the face and body. Most persons never noticed the increase in heat and heartbeat, and the first they knew was when the scarlet rash came out. Usually they had convulsions at the time of the appearance of the rash, but these convulsions did not last long and were not very severe. If one lived through them, he became perfectly quiet, and only did he feel a numbness swiftly creeping up his body from the feet. The heels became numb first, then the legs and hips, and when the numbness reached as high as his heart, he died. They did not rave or sleep. Their minds always remained cool and calm, up to the moment their heart numbed and stopped. And another strange thing was the rapidity of decomposition. No sooner was a person dead than the body seemed to fall to pieces, to fly apart, to melt away even as you looked at it. That was one of the reasons the plague spread so rapidly. All the billions of germs in a corpse were so immediately released. And it was because of all this that the bacteriologists had so little chance in fighting the germs. They were killed in their laboratories even as they studied the germ of the Scarlet Death. They were heroes. As fast as they perished, others stepped forth and took their places. It was in London that they first isolated it. The news was telegraphed everywhere. Trask was the name of the man who succeeded in this, but within 30 hours he was dead. Then came the struggle in all the laboratories to find something that would kill the plague germs. All drugs failed. You see, the problem was to get a drug or serum that would kill the germs in the body and not kill the body. They tried to fight it with other germs, to put into the body of a sick man, germs that were enemies of the plague germs. And you can't see these germ things, Grancer? Harelip objected. And here you gabble, gabble, gabble all about them as if they was anything, when they are nothing at all. Anything you can't see ain't. That's what. Fighting things that ain't things with things that ain't. They must have been all fools in them days. That's why they croaked. I ain't going to believe in such rot, I tell you that. Grancer promptly began to weep, while Edwin hotly took up his defence. Look here, Harelip, you believe in lots of things you can't see. Harelip shook his head. You believe in dead men walking about. You never seen one dead man walk about. I tell you, I seen 'em last winter when I was wolf hunting with Dad. Well, you always spit when you cross water, Edwin challenged. That's to keep off bad luck, was Harelip's defence. You believe in bad luck, and you ain't never seen bad luck, Edwin concluded triumphantly. You're just as bad as Grancer and his germs. You believe in what you don't see. Go on, Grancer. Harelip, crushed by this metaphysical defeat, remained silent, and the old man went on. Often and often, though his narrative must not be clogged by the details, was Grancer's tale interrupted while the boys squabbled among themselves. Also, among themselves, they kept up a constant, low-voiced exchange of explanation and conjecture as they strove to follow the old man into his unknown and vanished world. The Scarlet Death broke out in San Francisco. The first death came on a Monday morning. By Thursday, they were dying like flies in Oakland and San Francisco. They died everywhere, in their beds, at their work, walking along the street. It was on Tuesday that I saw my first death. Miss Colbrand, one of my students, sitting right there before me, my eyes, in my lecture room. I noticed her face while I was talking. It had suddenly turned scarlet. I ceased speaking and could only look at her, for the fear of the plague was already on all of us, and we knew that it had come. The young woman screamed and ran out of the room. So did the young men run out, all but two. Miss Colbrand's convulsions were very mild and lasted less than a minute. One of the young men fetched her a glass of water. She drank only a little bit of it and cried out, "My feet! All sensation has left them." After a minute she said, "I have no feet. I am unaware that I have feet, and my knees are cold. I can scarcely feel that I have knees." She lay on the floor, a bundle of notebooks under her head, and we could do nothing. The coldness and the numbness crept past her hips to her heart, and when it reached her heart, she was dead. In 15 minutes, by the clock, I timed it. She was dead, there, in my own classroom, dead. And she was a very beautiful, strong, healthy young woman. And from the first sign of the plague to her death, only 15 minutes elapsed. That will show you how swift was the Scarlet Death. Guess whose coffee went cold? I'm setting up for the video. Yet in those few minutes, I remained with the dying woman in my classroom. The alarm had spread over the university, and the students, by thousands, all of them, had deserted the lecture room and laboratories. When I emerged on my way to make report to the president of the faculty, I found the university deserted. Across the campus were several strugglers hurrying for their homes. Two of them were running. President Hogue I found in his office, all alone, looking very old and very grey, with a multitude of wrinkles in his face that I had never seen before. At sight of me, he pulled himself to his feet and tottered away to the inner office, banging the door after him and locking it. You see, he knew I had been exposed, and he was afraid. He shouted to me through the door to go away. I shall never forget my feelings as I walked down the silent corridors and out across that deserted campus. I was not afraid. I had been exposed, and I looked upon myself as already dead. It was not that, but a feeling of awful depression that impressed me. Everything had stopped. It was like the end of the world to me, my world. I had been born within sight and sound of the university. It had been my predestined career. My father had been a professor there before me, and his father before him. For a century and a half had this university, like a splendid machine, been running steadily on. And now, in an instant, it had stopped. It was like seeing the sacred flame lie down on some thrice sacred altar. I was shocked, unutterably shocked. When I arrived, my housekeeper screamed as I entered and fled away. And when I rang, I found the housemaid had likewise fled. I investigated. In the kitchen, I found the cook on the point of departure, but she screamed too, and in her haste dropped a suitcase of her personal belongings and ran out of the house and across the grounds, still screaming. I can hear her scream to this day. You see, we did not act in this way when ordinary diseases smote us. We were always calm over such things and sent for the doctors and nurses who knew just what to do. But this was different. It struck so suddenly and killed so swiftly and never missed a stroke. When the scarlet rash appeared on a person's face, that person was marked by death. There was never a known case of recovery. I was alone in my big house, as I have told you often before. In those days we could talk with one another over wires or through the air. The telephone bell rang, and I found my brother talking to me. He told me that he was not coming home for fear of catching the plague from me, and that he had taken our two sisters to stop at Professor Bacon's home. He advised me to remain where I was and wait to find out whether or not I had caught the plague. To all of this I agreed, staying in my house and for the first time in my life attempting to cook. And the plague did not come out on me. By means of the telephone I could talk with whomsoever I pleased and get the news. Also there were the newspapers, and I ordered all of them to be thrown up to my door so that I could know what was happening with the rest of the world. New York City and Chicago were in chaos, and what happened with them was happening in all the large cities. A third of the New York police were dead. Their chief was also dead. Likewise the mayor. All law and order had ceased. The bodies were lying in the streets unburied. All railroads and vessels carrying food and such things into the great city had ceased, and mobs of the hungry poor were pillaging the stores and warehouses. Murder and robbery and drunkenness were everywhere. Already the people had fled from the city by millions. At first the rich in their private cars and motor cars and dirigibles, and then the great mass of the population on foot, carrying the plague with them, themselves starving and pillaging the farmers and all the towns and villages on the way. The man who sent this news, the wireless operator, was alone with his instrument on the top of the building. The people remaining in the city, he estimated them at several 100,000, had gone mad from fear and drink, and on all sides of him great fires were raging. He was a hero, the man who stayed by his post, an obscure newspaper man most likely. For 24 hours, he said, no transatlantic airships had arrived and no more messages were coming from England. He did state, though, that a message from Berlin, that's in Germany, announced that Hofmeier, a bacteriologist from the Metchnikoff School, had discovered the serum for the plague. That was the last word, to this day, that we of America ever received from Europe. If Hofmeier discovered the serum, it was too late, or otherwise, long ere this, explorers from Europe would have come looking for us. We can only conclude that what happened in America happened in Europe, and that, at the best, some several score may have survived that scarlet death on that whole continent. For one day longer the dispatches continued to come from New York, then they too ceased. The man who had sent them, perched in his lofty building, had either died of the plague or been consumed in the great conflagrations he had described as raging around him. And what had occurred in New York had been duplicated in all the other cities. It was the same in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley. By Thursday, the people were dying so rapidly that their corpses could not be handled and dead bodies lay everywhere. Thursday night, the panic outrush for the country began. Imagine, my grandsons, people thicker than the salmon run you have seen on the Sacramento River, pouring out of the cities by millions, madly over the country, in vain attempt to escape the ubiquitous death. You see, they carried the germs with them. Even the airships of the rich, fleeing from mountains and desert fastness, carried the germs. Hundreds of these airships escaped to Hawaii, and not only did they bring the plague with them, but they found the plague already there before them. This we learned by the dispatches until all order in San Francisco vanished and there were no operators left at their posts to receive or send. It was amazing, astounding, this loss of communication with the world. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, been blotted out. For 60 years that world has no longer existed for me. I know there must be such places as New York, Europe, Asia and Africa, but not one word has been heard of them, not in 60 years. With the coming of the Scarlet Death, the world fell apart. Absolutely, irretrievably. 10,000 years of culture and civilization passed in the twinkling of an eye, lapsed like foam. I was telling about the airships of the rich. They carried the plague with them, and no matter where they fled, they died. I never encountered but one survivor from any of them, Mungerson. He was afterwards a Santa Rosan, and he married my eldest daughter. He came into the tribe 8 years after the plague. He was then 19 years old, and he was compelled to wait 12 years before he could marry. You see, there were no unmarried women, and some of the older daughters of the Santa Rosans were already bespoken. So he was forced to wait until my Mary had grown to 16 years. It was his son, Gimpleg, who was killed last year by the mountain lion. Mungerson was 11 years old at the time of the plague. His father was one of the industrial magnates, a very wealthy, powerful man. It was on his airship, the Condor, that they were fleeing, with all the family for the wilds of British Columbia, which is far to the north of here. But there was some accident, and they were wrecked near Mount Shasta. You have heard of that mountain, it is far to the north. The plague broke out amongst them, and this boy of 11 was the only survivor. For 8 years he was alone, wandering over a deserted land, looking vainly for his own kind, and at last, travelling south, he picked up with us, the Santa Rosans. But I am ahead of my story. When the great exodus from the cities around San Francisco Bay began, while the telephones were still working, I talked with my brother. I told him this flight from the cities was insanity, that there were no symptoms of the plague in me, and that the thing for us to do was to isolate ourselves and our relatives in some safe place. We decided on the chemistry building at the university, and we planned to lay in a supply of provisions and by force of arms to prevent any other persons from forcing their presence upon us after we had retired to our refuge. All this being arranged, preppers, 1913 envisionary version of preppers. All this being arranged, my brother begged me to stay in my own house for at least 24 hours more on the chance of the plague developing in me. To this I agreed, and he promised to come for me next day. We talked over the details of the provisioning and the defending of the chemistry building until the telephone died. It died in the midst of our conversation. That evening there were no electric lights, and I was alone in my house in the darkness. No more newspapers were being printed, so I had no knowledge of what was taking place outside. I heard sounds of rioting and of pistol shots, and from my windows I could see the glare of the sky of some conflagration in the direction of Oakland. It was a night of terror. I did not sleep a wink. A man, why and how I do not know, was killed on the sidewalk in front of the house. I heard the rapid reports of an automatic pistol, and a few minutes later the wounded wretch crawled up to my door, moaning and crying out for help. Arming myself with 2 automatics, I went to him. By the light of a match, I ascertained that while he was dying of the bullet wounds, at the same time the plague was on him. I fled indoors, whence I heard him moan and cry out for half an hour longer. In the morning my brother came to me. I had gathered into a handbag what things of value I purposed taking, but when I saw his face, I knew that he would never accompany me to the chemistry building. The plague was on him. He intended shaking my hand, but I went back hurriedly before him. Look at yourself in the mirror, I commanded. He did so, and at sight of his scarlet face, the colour deepening as he looked at it, he sank down nervelessly in a chair. My God, he said, I've got it. Don't come near me. I'm already a dead man. Then the convulsions seized him. He was 2 hours in dying, and he was conscious to the last, complaining about the coldness and loss of sensation in his feet, his calves, his thighs, until at last it was his heart, and he was dead. That was the way the Scarlet Death slew. I caught up my handbag and fled. The sights in the streets were terrible. One stumbled on bodies everywhere. Some were not yet dead. And even as you looked, you saw men sink down with the death fastened upon them. There were numerous fires burning in Berkeley, while Oakland and San Francisco were apparently swept by vast conflagrations. The smoke of the burning filled the heavens, so that the midday was a gloomy twilight, and in the shifts of wind, sometimes the sun shone through dimly, a dull red orb. Truly, my grandsons, it was like the last days of the end of the world. There were numerous stalled motor cars showing that the gasoline and the engine supplies of the garage had given out. I remember one such car. A man and a woman lay dead in the seats, and on the pavement near it were 2 more women and a child. Strange and terrible sights there were on every hand. People slipped by silently, furtively, like ghosts. White-faced women carrying infants in their arms, fathers leading children by the hand, singly and in couples and in families, all fleeing out of the city of death. Some carried supplies of food, others blankets and valuables, and there were many who carried nothing. There was a grocery store, a place where food was sold. The man to whom it belonged, I knew him well. A quiet, sober, but stupid and obstinate fellow was defending it. The women and doors had been broken in, but he inside, hiding behind a counter, was discharging his pistol at a number of men on the sidewalk who were breaking in. In the entrance were several bodies, of men, I decided, whom he had killed earlier in the day. Even as I looked on from a distance, I saw one of the robbers break the windows of the adjoining store, a place where shoes were sold, and deliberately set fire to it. I did not go to the grocery man's assistance. The time for such acts had already passed. Civilization was crumbling, and it was each for himself. I went away hastily, down a cross street, and at the first corner I saw another tragedy. 2 men of the working class had caught a man and a woman with 2 children and were robbing them. I knew the man by sight, though I had never been introduced to him. He was a poet whose verses I had long admired. Where are we? Yet I did not go to his help, for at the moment I came upon the scene there was a pistol shot and I saw him sinking to the ground. The woman screamed and she was felled with a fist blow by one of the brutes. I cried out threateningly, whereupon they discharged their pistols at me, and I ran away around the corner. Here I was blocked by an advancing conflagration. The buildings on both sides were burning, and the street was filled with smoke and flame. From somewhere in that murk came a woman's voice, calling shrilly for help, but I did not go to her. A man's heart turned to iron amid such scenes, and one heard all too many appeals for help. Returning to the corner, I found the 2 robbers were gone. The poet and his wife lay dead on the pavement. It was a shocking sight. The 2 children had vanished, whither I could not tell. And I knew now why it was that the fleeing persons I encountered slipped along so furtively and with such white faces. In the midst of our civilization, down in our slums, We had bred a race of barbarians, of savages, and now, in the time of our calamity, they turned upon us like the wild beasts they were and destroyed us. And they destroyed themselves as well. They inflamed themselves with strong drink and committed 1,000 atrocities, quarrelling and killing one another in the general madness. One group of working men I saw, of the better sort, who had banded together and with their women and children in their midst, the sick and aged in litters and being carried, and with a number of horses pulling a truckload of provisions, they were fighting their way out of the city. They made a fine spectacle as they came down the street through the drifting smoke, though they nearly shot me when I first appeared in their path. As they went by, one of their leaders shouted out to me in apologetic explanation. He said they were killing the robbers and looters on sight, and that they had thus banded together as the only means by which to escape the prowlers. It was here that I saw for the first time what I was soon to see so often. One of the marching men had suddenly shown the unmistakable mark of the plague. Immediately those about him drew away, and he, without a remonstrance, stepped out of his place to let them pass on. A woman, most probably his wife, attempted to follow him. She was leading a little boy by the hand, but the husband commanded her sternly to go on, while others laid hands on her and restrained her from following him. This I saw, and I saw the man also, with his scarlet blaze of a face, step into a doorway on the opposite side of the street. I heard the report of his pistol and saw him sink lifeless to the ground. After being turned aside twice, again by advancing fires, I succeeded in getting through to the university. On the edge of the campus I came upon a party of university folk who were going in the direction of the chemistry building. They were all family men, and their families were with them, including the nurses and the servants. Professor Badminton greeted me, and I had difficulty in recognising him. Somewhere he had gone through flames, and his beard was singed off. About his head was a bloody bandage, and his clothes were filthy. He told me he had been cruelly beaten by prowlers, and that his brother had been killed the previous night in the defence of their building. Midway across the campus, he pointed suddenly to Mrs. Swinton's face. The unmistakable Scarlet was there. Immediately, all the other women set up a screaming and began to run away from her. Her 2 children were with the nurse, and these also ran with the women, but her husband, Dr. Swinton, remained with her. Go on, Smith, he told me. Keep an eye on the children. As for me, I shall stay with my wife. I know she's already dead, but I can't leave her. Afterward, if I escape, I shall come to the chemistry building, and do you watch for me and let me in. I left him bending over his wife and soothing her last moments while I ran to overtake the party. We were the last to be admitted to the chemistry building. After that, with our automatic rifles, we maintained our isolation. By our plans, we had arranged for a company of 60 to be in this refuge. Instead, every one of the number originally planned had added relatives and friends and whole families until there were over 400 souls. But the chemistry building was large and, standing by itself, was in no danger of being burned by the great fires that raged everywhere in the city. A large quantity of provisions had been gathered, and a food committee took charge of it, issuing rations daily to the various families and groups that arranged themselves into messes. A number of committees were appointed, and we developed a very efficient organisation. I was on the Committee of Defence. Over the first day, no prowlers came near. We could see them in the distance, however, and by the smoke of their fires knew that several camps of them were occupying the far edge of the campus. Drunkenness was rife, and often we heard them singing ribald songs or insanely shouting, while the world crashed to ruin about them and all the air was filled with the smoke of its burning. These low creatures gave rein to their bestiality and fought and drank and died. And after all, what did it matter? Everybody died anyway, the good and the bad, the efficient and the weaklings, those that loved to live and those that scorned to live. They passed. Everything passed. When the 24 hours had gone by and no signs of the plague were apparent, we congratulated ourselves and set about digging a well. You have seen the great iron pipes which in those days carried water to all the city dwellers. We feared that the fires in the city would burst the pipes and empty the reservoirs. So we tore up the cement floor of the central court of the chemistry building and dug a well. There were many young men, undergraduates with us, and we worked night and day on the well, and our fears were confirmed. 3 hours before we reached water, the pipes went dry. A second 24 hours passed, and still the plague did not appear among us. We thought we were saved, but we did not know what I afterwards decided to be true, namely that the period of the incubation of the plague germs in a human's body was a matter of a number of days. It slew so swiftly when once it manifested itself that we were led to believe that the period of incubation was equally swift. So, when 2 days had left us unscathed, we were elated with the idea that we were free of the contagion. But the third day disillusioned us. I can never forget the night preceding it. I had charge of the night guards from 8 to 12, and from the roof of the building I watched the passing of all man's glorious works. So terrible were the local conflagrations that all the sky was lighted up. One could read the finest print in the red glare. All the world seemed wrapped in flames. San Francisco spouted smoke and fire, and the score of vast conflagrations that were like so many active volcanoes. Oakland, San Leandro, Haywards, all were burning, and to the northward, clear to Point Richmond, other fires were at work. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle. Civilization was passing in a sheet of flame and a breath of death. At 10 o'clock that night, the great powder magazines at Point Pinole exploded in rapid succession. So terrific were the concussions that the strong buildings rocked as in an earthquake, while every pane of glass was broken. It was then that I left the roof and went down the long corridors from room to room, quieting the alarmed women and telling them what had happened. An hour later, at the window on the ground floor, I heard pandemonium break out in the camps of the prowlers. There were cries and screams and shots from many pistols. As we afterward conjectured, this fight had been precipitated by an attempt on the part of those that were well to drive out those that were sick. At any rate, a number of the plague-stricken prowlers escaped across the campus and drifted against our doors. We warned them back, but they cursed us and discharged a fusillade from their pistols. Professor Merriweather at one of the windows was instantly killed, the bullet striking him squarely between the eyes. We opened fire in turn, and all the prowlers fled with the exception of 3. One was a woman. The plague was on them, and they were reckless. Like foul fiends there in the red glare from the skies, with faces blazing, they continued to curse us and fire at us. One of the men I shot with my own hand. After that, the other man and the woman, still cursing us, lay down under our windows where we were compelled to watch them die of the plague. The situation was critical. The explosions of the powder magazines had broken all the windows of the chemistry building so that we were exposed to the germs from the corpses. The sanitary committee was called upon to act, and it responded nobly. 2 men were required to go out and remove the corpses, and that meant the probable sacrifice of their own lives. For having performed the task, they were not to be permitted to re-enter the building. One of the professors, who was a bachelor, and one of the undergraduates volunteered. They bade goodbye to us and went forth. They were heroes. They gave up their lives that 400 others might live. After they had performed their work, they stood for a moment at a distance looking at us wistfully. Then they waved their hands in farewell and went away slowly across the campus towards the burning building. Towards the burning city, rather, and yet it was all useless. The next morning, the first one of us was smitten with the plague, a little nurse girl in the family of Professor Stout. It was no time for weak-kneed sentimental policies. On the chance that she might be the only one, we thrust her forth from the building and commanded her to be gone. She went away slowly across the campus, wringing her hands and crying pitifully. We felt like brutes, but what were we to do? There were 400 of us, and individuals had to be sacrificed. In one of the laboratories, 3 families had domiciled themselves, and that afternoon we found among them no less than 4 corpses and 7 cases of the plague in all its different stages. Then it was that the horror began. Leaving the dead lie, we forced the living ones to segregate themselves in another room. The plague began to break out amongst the rest of us, and as fast as the symptoms appeared, we sent the stricken ones to these segregated rooms. We compelled them to walk there by themselves so as to avoid laying hands on them. It was heart-rending, but still the plague raged among us, and room after room was filled with the dead and dying. And so we who were yet clean retreated to the next floor and to the next, before this sea of dead that room by room and floor by floor inundated the building. The place became a charnel house, and in the middle of the night the survivors fled forth, taking nothing with them except arms and ammunition and a heavy store of tinned foods. We camped on the opposite side of the campus from the prowlers, and while some stood guard, others of us volunteered to scout into the city in quest of horses, motor cars, carts and wagons, or anything that would carry our provisions and enable us to emulate the banded working men I had seen fight their way out to open country. I was one of these scouts, and Dr. Hoyle, remembering that his motor car had been left behind in his home garage, told me to look for it. We scouted in pairs, and Dombey, a young undergraduate, accompanied me. We had to cross half a mile of the residence portion of the city to get to Dr. Hoyle's home. Here the buildings stood apart, in the midst of trees and grassy lawns, and here the fires had played freaks, burning whole blocks, skipping blocks, and often skipping a single house in a block. And here too the prowlers were still at their work. We carried our automatic pistols openly in our hands and looked desperate enough, forsooth, to keep them from attacking us. But at Dr. Hoyle's house the thing happened. Untouched by fire, even as we came to it, the smoke of flames burst forth. The miscreant who had set fire to it staggered down the steps and out along the driveway. Sticking out of his coat pockets were bottles of whiskey, and he was very drunk. My first impulse was to shoot him, and I have never ceased regretting that I did not. Standing and maundering to himself, with bloodshot eyes and a raw bleeding slash down one side of his bewhiskered face, he was altogether the most nauseating specimen of degradation and filth I had ever encountered. I did not shoot him, and he leaned against a tree on the lawn to let us go by. It was the most absolute wanton act. Just as we were opposite him, he suddenly drew a pistol and shot Dombey through the head. The next instant I shot him, but it was too late. Dombey expired without a groan, immediately. I doubt if he even knew what had happened to him. Leaving the 2 corpses, I hurried on past the burning house to the garage and there found Dr. Hoyle's motor car. The tanks were filled with gasoline and it was ready for use. And it was in this car that I threaded the streets of the ruined city and came back to the survivors on the campus. The other scouts returned, but none had been so fortunate. Professor Fairmead had found a Shetland pony, but the poor creature, tied in a stable and abandoned for days, was so weak from want of food and water that it could carry no burden at all. Some of the men were for turning it loose, but I insisted that we should lead it along with us, so that if we got out of food, we should have it to eat. There were 47 of us when we started, many being women and children. The president of the faculty, an old man to begin with and now helplessly broken by the awful happenings of the past week, rode in the motor car with several young children, and the aged mother of Professor Fairmead. What Hope, a young professor of English who had a grievous bullet wound in his leg, drove the car. The rest of us walked, Professor Fairmead leading the pony. It was what should have been a bright summer day, but the smoke from the burning world filled the sky, through which the sun shone murkily, a dull and lifeless orb, blood-red and ominous. But we had grown accustomed to that blood-red sun. With the smoke it was different. It bit into our nostrils and eyes, and there was no one of us whose eyes were not bloodshot. We directed our course to the southeast, through the endless miles of suburban residences, travelling along where the first swells of low hills rose from the flat of the central city. It was by this way only that we could expect to gain the country. Our progress was painfully slow. The women and children could not walk fast. They did not dream of walking, my grandsons, in the way all people walk today. In truth, None of us knew how to walk. It was not until after the plague that I learned really to walk. So it was that the pace of the slowest was the pace of all, for we dared not separate on account of the prowlers. There were not so many now of these human beasts of prey. The plague had already well diminished their numbers, but enough still lived to be a constant menace to us. Many of the beautiful residences were untouched by fire, yet smoking ruins were everywhere. The prowlers, too, seemed to have got over their insensate desire to burn, and it was more rarely that we saw houses freshly on fire. Several of us scouted among the private garages in search of motor cars and gasoline, but in this we were unsuccessful. The first great flight from the cities had swept all such utilities away. Galgan, a fine young man, was lost in this work. He was shot by prowlers while crossing a lawn. Yet this was our only casualty, though once a drunken brute deliberately opened fire on all of us. Luckily, he fired wildly and we shot him before he had done any hurt. At Fruitvale, still in the heart of the magnificent residence section of the city, the plague again smote us. Professor Fairmead was the victim. Making signs to us that his mother was not to know, he turned aside to the grounds of a beautiful mansion. He sat down forlornly on the steps of the front veranda, and I, having lingered, waved him a last farewell. That night, several miles beyond Fruitvale and still in the city, we made camp. And that night we shifted camp twice to get away from our dead. In the morning there were 30 of us. I shall never forget the president of the faculty. During the morning's march, his wife, who was walking, betrayed the fatal symptoms. And when she drew aside to let us go on, he insisted on leaving the motor car and remaining with her. There was quite a discussion about this, but in the end we gave in. It was just as well, for we knew not which ones of us, if any, might ultimately escape. That night, the second of our march, we camped beyond Haywards in the first stretches of country. And in the morning there were 11 of us that lived. Also, during the night, What Hope, the professor with the wounded leg, deserted us in the motor car. He took with him his sister and his mother and most of our tinned provisions. It was that day in the afternoon, while resting beside the wayside, that I saw the last airship I shall ever see. The smoke was much thinner here in the country, and I first sighted the ship drifting and veering helplessly at an elevation of 2,000 feet. What had happened I could not conjecture, but even as we looked we saw her bow dip down lower and lower. Then the bulkheads of the various gas chambers must have burst, for, quite perpendicular, she fell like a plummet to the earth. And from that day to this, I have not seen another airship. Often and often during the next few years, I scanned the sky for them, hoping against hope that somewhere in the world civilization had survived. But it was not to be. What happened with us in California must have happened with everybody everywhere. Another day, and at Niles there were 3 of us. Beyond Niles, in the middle of the highway, we found What Hope. The motor car had broken down, and there on the rugs which they had spread on the ground lay the bodies of his sister, his mother, and himself. Wearied by the unusual exercise of continued walking, that night I slept heavily. In the morning I was alone in the world. Canfield and Parsons, my last companions, were dead of the plague. Of the 400 that sought shelter in the chemistry building, and of the 47 that began the march, I alone remained. I and the Shetland pony. Why this should be so there is no explaining. I did not catch the plague, that is all. I was immune. I was merely the one lucky man in a million, just as every survivor was one in a million, or rather in several millions, for the proportion was at least that. For 2 days I sheltered in a pleasant grove where there had been no deaths. In those days, while badly depressed and believing that my turn would come at any moment, nevertheless, I rested and recuperated. So did the pony. And on the 3rd day, putting what small store of tinned provisions I possessed on the pony's back, I started out across a very lonely land. Not a live man, woman or child did I encounter, though the dead were everywhere. Food, however, was abundant. The land then was not as it is now. It was all cleared of trees and brush, and it was cultivated. The food for millions of mouths was growing, ripening, and going to waste. From the fields and orchards I gathered vegetables, fruits and berries. Around the deserted farmhouses I got eggs and caught chickens, and frequently I found supplies of tinned provisions in the storerooms. Yeah, in 1913, if the city died and you ran away from the city, you would have found lots of little small holdings and you would have found lots of food. In 2013, if the cities died, you might have found a shed full of battery hens or a greenhouse full of tomatoes. And in either case, what you'd find is what happens to a battery farm or a greenhouse when it's got no electricity. Everything would be dead and rotten. The strange thing was what was taking place with all domestic animals. Everywhere they were going wild and preying on one another. The chickens and ducks were the first to be destroyed, while the pigs were the first to go wild, followed by the cats. Nor were the dogs long in adapting themselves to the changed conditions. There was a veritable plague of dogs. They devoured the corpses, barked and howled during the nights, and in the daytime slunk about in the distance. As the time went by, I noticed a change in their behaviour. At first, they were apart from one another, very suspicious and very prone to fight. But after a not very long while, they began to come together and run in packs. The dog, you see, always was a social animal, and this was true before ever he came to be domesticated by man. In the last days of the world, before the plague, there were many, many different kinds of dogs. Dogs without hair and dogs with warm fur. Dogs so small they would scarcely make a mouthful for other dogs that were as large as mountain lions. Well, all the small dogs and weak types were killed by their fellows. Also, the very large ones were not adapted for the wild life and bred out. As a result, the many different kinds of dogs disappeared, and there remained running in packs the medium-sized wolfish dogs that you know today. But the cats don't run in packs, Grancer, Hoo objected. The cat was never a social animal. As one writer in the 19th century said, the cat walks by himself. He always walked by himself, from before the time he was tamed by man down through the long ages of domestication to today, when once more he is wild. The horses also went wild, and all the fine breeds we had degenerated into the small Mustang horse you know today. The cows likewise went wild, as did the pigeons and the sheep. 1913, a lot of people kept pigeons as a hobby, racing pigeons. And the sheep. And that a few of the chickens survived, you know yourself, but the wild chicken of today is quite a different thing from the chickens we had in those days. But I must go on with my story. I travelled through a deserted land. As the time went by, I began to yearn more and more for human beings, but I never found one, and I grew lonelier and lonelier. I crossed Livermore Valley and the mountains between it and the great valley of the San Joaquin. You have never seen that valley, but it is very large, and it is the home of the wild horses. There are great droves there, thousands and tens of thousands. I revisited it 30 years after, so I know. You think there are lots of wild horses down here on the coast valleys, but they are nothing compared with those of the San Joaquin. Strange to say, the cows, when they went wild, went back into the lower mountains. Evidently, they were better able to protect themselves there. In the country districts, the ghouls and prowlers had been less in evidence, for I found many villages and towns untouched by fire. But they were filled by the pestilential dead, and I passed by without exploring them. It was near Lathrop that, out of my loneliness, I picked up a pair of collie dogs that were so newly free that they were urgently willing to return to their allegiance to man. These collies accompanied me for many years, and the strains of them are in those very dogs there that you boys have today. But in 60 years, the collie strain has worked out. These brutes are more like domesticated wolves than anything else. Hairlip arose to his feet, glanced to see the goats were safe, and looked at the sun's position in the afternoon sky. Advertising impatience at the prolixity of the old man's tale. Urged to hurry by Edwin, Grancer went on. There is little more to tell. With my 2 dogs and my pony and riding a horse I had managed to capture, I crossed the San Joaquin and went on to a wonderful valley in the Sierras called Yosemite. In the great hotel there, I found a prodigious supply of tinned provisions. The pasture was abundant, as was the game, and the river that ran through the valley was full of trout. I remained there 3 years in an utter loneliness that none but a man who had once been highly civilized can understand. Then I could stand it no more. I felt that I was going crazy. Like the dog, I was a social animal and I needed my kind. I reasoned that since I had survived the plague, there was a possibility that others had survived also. I reasoned that after 3 years the plague germs must be all gone and the land be clean again. With my horse and dogs and pony I set out. Again I crossed the San Joaquin Valley, the mountains beyond, and came down into Livermore Valley. The change in those 3 years was amazing. All the land had been splendidly tilled, and now I could scarcely recognise it. Such was the sea of rank vegetation that had overrun the agricultural handiwork of man. You see, the wheat, the vegetables and orchard trees had always been cared for and nursed by man, so that they were soft and tender. The weeds and wild bushes and such things, on the contrary, had always been fought by man, so that they were tough and resistant. As a result, when the hand of man was removed, the wild vegetation smothered and destroyed practically all the domesticated vegetation. The coyotes were greatly increased, and it was at this time that I first encountered wolves, staying in 2s and 3s and small packs, down from the regions where they had always persisted. It was at Lake Temescal, not far from the one-time city of Oakland, that I came upon the first live human beings. Oh, my grandsons, how can I describe to you my emotion? When astride my horse and dropping down the hillside to the lake, I saw the smoke of a campfire rising through the trees. Almost did my heart stop beating. I felt that I was going crazy. Then I heard the cry of a baby, a human babe, and the dogs barked and my dogs answered. I did not know but what I was the one human being alive in the whole world. It could not be true, but here were others, smoke and the cry of a babe. Emerging on the lake there before my eyes, not 100 yards away, I saw a man, a large man. He was standing on an out-jutting rock and fishing. I was overcome. I stopped my horse. I tried to call out, but could not. I waved my hand. It seemed to me that the man looked at me, but he did not appear to wave. I was afraid to look again, for I knew it was an hallucination, and I knew that if I looked, the man would be gone. And so precious was the hallucination that I wanted it to persist yet a little while longer. I knew, too, that as long as I did not look, it would persist. Thus I remained until I heard my dog snarling and a man's voice. What do you think the voice said? I will tell you. It said, "Where the hell did you come from?" Those were the exact words. The exact words. That was what your other grandfather said to me, Hare Lip, when he greeted me there on the shore of Lake Temescal 57 years ago, and they were the most ineffable words I've ever heard. I opened my eyes, and there he stood before me, a large, dark, hairy man, heavy-jawed, slant-browed, fierce-eyed. How I got off my horse I do not know, but it seemed that next I knew I was clasping his hand with both of mine and crying. I would have embraced him, but he was ever a narrow-minded, suspicious man, and he drew away from me. Yet did I cling to him and cry. Grance's voice faltered and broke at the recollection, and the weak tears streamed down his cheeks while the boys looked on and giggled. Yet did I cry, he continued, and desire to embrace him, though the chauffeur was a brute, a perfect brute, the most abhorrent man I have ever known. His name was... Strange how I have forgotten his name. Everybody called him chauffeur. It was the name of his occupation, and it stuck. That is how, to this day, the tribe he founded is called the chauffeur tribe. He was a violent, unjust man. Why the plague germs spared him, I can never understand. It would seem, in spite of our old metaphysical notions about absolute justice, that there is no justice in the universe. Why did he live? an iniquitous moral monster, a blot on the face of nature, a cruel, relentless, bestial cheat as well. All he could talk about was motor cars, machinery, gasoline and garages, and especially and with huge delight of his mean pilferings and sordid swindlings of the persons who had employed him in the days before the coming of the plague. And yet he was spared, while hundreds of millions, yea, billions of better men were destroyed. I went on with him to his camp, and there I saw her, Vesta, the one woman. It was glorious and pitiful. There she was, Vesta Van Warden, clad in rags with mud and scarred and toil-calloused hands, bending over the campfire and doing scullion work. She, Vesta, who had been born to the purple of the greatest baronage of wealth the world has ever known. John Van Warden, her husband, worth 1,800,000,000. Yeah, 1913, 1.8 billion was as much money as he could imagine. And president of the Board of Industrial Magnates. Without World War I and World War II, he imagined America would obviously have become a capitalist fascist democracy, fascist dictatorship. Had been the ruler of America. Also sitting on the International Board of Control, he had been one of the 7 men who ruled the world, and she herself had come of equally noble stock. Her father, Philip Saxon, had been president of the Board of Industrial Magnates up to the time of his death. This office was in the process of becoming hereditary. America was getting a king. And had Philip Saxon had a son, that son would have succeeded him, but his only child was Vesta, the perfect flower of generations of the highest culture this planet has ever produced. It was not until the engagement between Vesta and Van Warden took place that Saxon indicated the latter as his successor. It was, I am sure, a political marriage. I have reason to believe that Vesta never really loved her husband in the mad, passionate way of which the poets used to sing. It was more like the marriages that obtained among the crowned heads of Europe in the days before they were displaced by the magnates. And there she was, boiling fish chowder in a soot-covered pot, her glorious eyes inflamed by the acrid smoke of the fire. Hers was a sad story. She was the one survivor in a million, as I had been, as the chauffeur had been. On a crowning eminence of the Alameda Hills, overlooking San Francisco Bay, Van Warden had built a vast summer palace. It was surrounded by a park of 1,000 acres. When the plague broke out, Van Warden sent her there. Armed guards patrolled the boundaries of the park, and nothing entered in the way of provisions or even mail matter that was not first fumigated. And yet did the plague enter, killing the guards at their posts, the servants at their tasks, sweeping away the whole army of retainers, or at least all of them who did not flee to die elsewhere. So it was that Vesta found herself the sole living person in the palace that had become a charnel house. Now the chauffeur had been one of the servants that ran away. Returning 2 months afterwards, he discovered Vesta in a little summer pavilion where there had been no deaths and where she had established herself. He was a brute. She was afraid, and she ran away and hid among the trees. That night, on foot, she fled into the mountains. She, whose tender feet and delicate body had never known the bruise of stones nor the scratch of briars. He followed her, and that night he caught her. He struck her. Do you understand? He beat her with those terrible fists of his and made her his slave. It was she who had to gather the firewood, build the fires, cook and do all the degrading camp labour. She who had never performed a menial act in her life. These things he compelled her to do, while he, a proper savage, elected to lie around the camp and look on. He did nothing, absolutely nothing, except on occasion to hunt meat or catch fish. Good for chauffeur, Harelit commented in an undertone to the other boys. I remember him before he died. He was a corker, but he did things and he made things go. You know, Dad married his daughter, and you ought to have seen the way he knocked spots out of Dad. The chauffeur was a son of a gun. He made us kids stand around, even when he was croaking. He reached out to me once and laid my head open with that long stick he always kept beside him. Hairlip rubbed his bullet head reminiscently, and the boys returned to the old man, who was maundering ecstatically about Vesta, the score of the founder of the chauffeur tribe. And so I say to you that you cannot understand the awfulness of the situation. The chauffeur was a servant. Understand? A servant. And he cringed with bowed head to such as she. She was a lord of life, both by birth and by marriage. The destinies of millions such as he she carried in the hollow of her pink-white hand. And in the days before the plague, the slightest contact with such as he would have been pollution. Oh, I have seen it. Once, I remember, there was Mrs. Goldwyn, wife of one of the great magnates. It was on a landing stage, just as she was embarking in her private dirigible, that she dropped her parasol. A servant picked it up and made the mistake of handing it to her, one of the greatest royal ladies of the land. She shrank back as though he were a leper and indicated her secretary to receive it. Also, she ordered her secretary to ascertain the creature's name and to see that he was immediately discharged from service. And such a woman was Vesta Van Worden, and her the chauffeur beat and made his slave. Bill, that was it. Bill the chauffeur, that was his name. He was a wretched primitive man, wholly devoid of the finer instincts and chivalrous promptings of a cultured soul. No, there is no absolute justice, for to him fell that wonder of womanhood, Vesta Van Worden. The grievousness of this you will never understand, my grandsons, for you are yourselves primitive little savages, unaware of aught else but savagery. Why should Vesta not have been mine? I was a man of culture and refinement, a professor in a great university. Even so, in the time before the plague, such was her exalted position, she would not have deigned to know that I existed. Mark then the abysmal degradation to which she fell at the hands of the chauffeur. Nothing less than the destruction of all mankind had made it possible that I should know her, look in her eyes, converse with her, touch her hand, aye, and love her, and know that her feelings to me were very kindly. I have reason to believe that she, even she, would have loved me, there being no man in the world except the chauffeur. Why, when it destroyed 8 billions of souls, did not the plague destroy just one more man, and that man the chauffeur? Once when the chauffeur was away fishing, she begged me to kill him. With tears in her eyes, she begged me to kill him, but he was a strong and violent man, and I was afraid. Afterwards I talked with him. I offered him my horse, my pony, my dogs, all that I possessed, if he would give Vesta to me, and he grinned in my face and shook his head. He was very insulting. He said that in the old days he had been a servant, had been dirt under the feet of men like me and of women like Vesta, and that now he had the greatest lady in the land to be servant to him and cook his food and nurse his brats. You had your day before the plague, he said, but this is my day, and a damn good day it is. I wouldn't trade back to the old times for anything. Such words he spoke, but they were not his words. He was a vulgar, low-minded man, and vile oaths fell continually from his lips. Also, he told me that if he caught me making eyes at his wife, he'd wring my neck and give her a beating as well. What was I to do? I was afraid. He was a brute. That first night when I discovered the camp, Vesta and I had a great talk about the things of our vanished world. We talked of art and books and poetry, and the chauffeur listened and grinned and sneered. He was bored and angered by our way of speech, which he did not comprehend. And finally he spoke up and he said, "And this is Vesta Van Worden, one time wife of Van Worden the magnate, a high and stuck-up beauty who is now my squaw. Eh, Professor Smith? Times is changed. Here, you, woman, take off my moccasins and lively about it. I want Professor Smith to see how well I have you trained." I saw her clench her teeth and the flame of revolt rise in her face. He drew back his gnarled fist to strike, and I was afraid and sick at heart. I could do nothing to prevail against him. So I got up to go. and not be witness to such indignity, but the chauffeur laughed and threatened me with a beating if I did not stay and behold. And I sat there, perforce, by the campfire on the shore of Lake Temescal, and saw Vesta Van Warden, kneel and remove the moccasins of that grinning ape-like human brute. Oh, you do not understand, my grandsons. You have never known anything else, and you do not understand. Halter broke and bridle wise, the chauffeur gloated while she performed that dreadful menial task. A trifle bulky at times, Professor, a trifle bulky, but a clout alongside the jaw makes her as meek and gentle as a lamb. And another time he said, we've got to start again, all over again, and replenish the earth and multiply. You're handicapped, Professor, you ain't got no wife, and we're up against the regular Garden of Eden proposition. But I ain't proud. I'll tell you what, Professor, he pointed at their little infant, barely a year old. There's your wife, though you'll have to wait till she grows up. It's rich, ain't it? We're all equals here, and I'm the biggest toad in the splash. But I ain't stuck up. Not I. I do you the honour, Professor Smith, the very great honour of betrothing to you my and Vesta Van Warden's daughter. Ain't it cussed bad that Van Warden ain't here to see? I lived 3 weeks of infinite torment there in the chauffeur's camp, and then one day, tiring of me, or of what to him was my bad effect on Vesta, he told me that the year before, wandering through the Contra Costa Hills to the Straits of Carquinez, across the straits he had seen smoke. This meant that there were still other human beings, and that for 3 weeks he had kept this inestimably precious information from me. I departed at once with my dogs and horses and journeyed across the Contra Hills to the Straits. I saw no smoke on the other side, but at Port Costa discovered a small steel barge on which I was able to embark my animals. Old canvas which I found served me for a sail, and a southerly breeze fanned me across the straits and up to the ruins of Vallejo. Here on the outskirts of the city I found evidences of a recently occupied camp. Many clamshells showed me why these humans had come to the shores of the bay. This was the Santa Rosa tribe, and I followed its track along the old railroad right-of-way across the salt marshes to Sonoma Valley. Here at the brickyard at Glen Ellen I came upon the camp. There were 18 souls all told. 2 were old men, one of whom was Jones, a banker. The other was Harrison, a retired pawnbroker, who had taken for wife the matron of the state hospital for the insane at Napa. All of the persons of the city of Napa and of all the other towns and villages in that rich and populous valley, of all them she'd been the only survivor. Next there were the 3 young men, Cardiff and Hale, who had been farmers, and Wainwright, a common day labourer. All 3 had found wives. To Hale, a crude illiterate farmer, had fallen Isadora, the greatest prize next to Vesta of all the women who came through the plague. She was one of the world's most noted singers, and the plague had caught her at San Francisco. She has talked with me for hours at a time, telling me of her adventures, until at last, rescued by Hale in the Mendocino Forest Reserve, there had remained nothing for her to do but become his wife. But Hale was a good fellow in spite of his illiteracy. He had a keen sense of justice and right dealing, and she was far happier with him than was Vesta with the chauffeur. The wives of Cardiff and Wainwright were ordinary women, accustomed to toil with strong constitutions, just the type for the wild new life to which they were compelled to live. In addition were 2 adult idiots from the feeble-minded home at Eldridge, and 5 or 6 young children and infants born after the formation of the Santa Rosa tribe. Also there was Bertha. She was a good woman, Harelip, in spite of the sneers of your father. Her I took for wife. She was the mother of your father, Edwin, and of yours, Hoo-Hoo, and it was our daughter, Vera, who married your father, Harelip. Your father, Sandow, who was the oldest son of Vesta Van Warden, and the chauffeur. And so it was that I became the 19th member of the Santa Rosa tribe. There were only 2 outsiders added after me. One was Mungerson, descended from the magnates who wandered alone in the wilds of Northern California for 8 years before he came south and joined us. He it was who waited 12 years more before he married my daughter, Mary. The other was Johnson, the man who founded the Utah tribe. That was where he came from, Utah, a country that lies very far away from here across the great deserts to the east. It was not until 27 years after the plague that Johnson reached California. In all that Utah region, he reported but 3 survivors, himself one, and all men. For many years, these 3 men lived and hunted together until at last, desperate, fearing that with them the human race would perish utterly from the planet, they headed westward on the possibility of finding women survivors in California. Johnson alone came through the great desert where his 2 companions died. He was 46 years old when he joined us, and he married the 4th daughter of Isadora and Hale, and his eldest son married your aunt, Harelip, who was the 3rd daughter of Vesta and the chauffeur. Johnson was a strong man with a will of his own, and it was because of this that he seceded from the Santa Rosans and formed the Utah tribe at San Jose. It is a small tribe. There are only 9 in it, but though he is dead, such was his influence and the strength of his breed that it will grow into a strong tribe and play a leading part in the re-civilization of the planet. There are only 2 other tribes that we know of, the Los Angelitos and the Carmelitos. The latter started from 1 man and woman. He was called Lopez, and he was descended from the ancient Mexicans and was very black. He was a cowherd in the ranges beyond Carmel, and his wife was a maid servant in the great Del Monte Hotel. It was 7 years before we first got in touch with the Los Angelitos. They have a good country down there, but it is too warm. I estimate the present population of the world at between 350 and 400, provided, of course, that there are no scattered little tribes elsewhere in the world. If there be such, we have not heard from them. Since Johnson crossed the desert from Utah, no word nor sign has come from the east or anywhere else. The great world which I knew in my boyhood and early manhood is gone. It has ceased to be. I am the last man who was alive in the last days of the plague and who knows the wonders of that far-off time. We who mastered the planet, its earth and sea and sky, and who were as very gods, now live in primitive savagery along the water courses of this California country. But we are increasing rapidly. Your sister, Harelip, already has 4 children. We are increasing rapidly and making ready for a new climb towards civilization. In time, pressure of population will compel us to spread out, and 100 generations from now we may expect our descendants to start to cross the Sierras, oozing slowly along generation by generation over the great continent to the colonization of the East, a new Aryan drift around the world. But it will be slow, very slow. We have so far to climb. We fell so hopelessly far. If only 1 physicist or 1 chemist had survived. But it was not to be, and we have forgotten everything. The chauffeur started working in iron. He made the forge which we use to this day, but he was a lazy man. And when he died, he took with him all that he knew of metals and machinery. What was I to know of such things? I was a classical scholar, not a chemist. The other men who survived were not educated. Only 2 things did the chauffeur accomplish: the brewing of strong drink and the growing of alcohol. It was while he was drunk once that he killed Vesta. I firmly believe that he killed Vesta in a fit of drunken cruelty, though he always maintained that she fell into the lake and was drowned. And, my grandsons, let me warn you against the medicine men. They call themselves doctors, travestying what was once a noble profession, but in reality they are medicine men, and they make for superstition and darkness. They are cheats and liars, but so debased and degraded are we that we believe their lies. They too will increase in numbers as we increase, and they will strive to rule us, yet they are liars and charlatans. Look at young Cross-Eyes posing as a doctor, selling charms against sickness, giving good hunting, exchanging promises of fair weather for good meat and skins, sending the death stick, performing 1,000 abominations. And yet I say to you that when he says he can do all these things, he lies. I, Professor Smith, Professor James Howard Smith say that he lies. I have told him so to his teeth. Why has he not sent me the death stick? Because he knows that with me it is without avail. But you, Harelip, so deeply are you sunk in black superstition that did you awake this night and find the death stick beside you, you would surely die. And you would die not because of any virtues in the stick, but because you are a savage, with the dark and clouded mind of a savage. The doctors must be destroyed, and all that was lost must be discovered over again. Wherefore earnestly I repeat unto you certain things which you must remember, and tell to your children after you. You must tell them that when water is made hot by fire, there resides in it a wonderful thing called steam, which is stronger than 10,000 men, and which can do all man's work for him. There are other very useful things. In the lightning flash resides a similarly strong servant of man, which was of old his slave, and which some day will be his slave again. Quite a different thing is the alphabet. It is what enables me to know the meaning of fine markings, whereas you boys only know rude picture writing. In that dry cave on Telegraph Hill, where you see me often go when the tribe is down by the sea, I have stored many books. In them is great wisdom. Also with them I have placed a key to the alphabet, so that one who knows picture writing may also know print. Some day men will read again, and then, if no accident has befallen my cave, they will know that Professor James Howard Smith once lived and saved for them the knowledge of the ancients. There is another device that men inevitably will rediscover. It is called gunpowder. It was what enabled us to kill surely and at long distances. Certain things which are found in the ground, when combined in the right proportions, will make this gunpowder. What these things are I have forgotten, or else I never knew, but I wish I did know. Then I would make the powder, and then I would certainly kill Cross-Eyes and rid the land of superstition. After I am man-grown, I'm going to give Cross-Eyes all the goats and meat and skins I can get, so that he'll teach me to be a doctor, Hoo-Hoo asserted. And when I know, I'll make everybody else sit up and take notice. They'll lay down in the dirt for me, you bet. The old man nodded his head solemnly and murmured, strange it is to hear the vestiges and remnants of the complicated Aryan speech falling from the lips of a little filthy-clad, skin-clad savage. All the world is topsy-turvy, ever since the plague. You won't make me sit up, Harelip boasted to the would-be medicine man. If I paid you for a sending of the death stick and it didn't work, I'd bust your head in. Understand you, Hoo-Hoo, you? I'm going to get Grancy to remember this here gunpowder stuff, Edwin said softly. And then I'll have you all on the run. You, Harelip, will do my fighting for me and get my meat for me. And you, Hoo-Hoo, will send the death stick for me and make everybody afraid. And if I catch Harelip trying to bust your head, Hoo-Hoo, I'll fix him with that same gunpowder. Grancer ain't such a fool as you think, and I'm going to listen to him, and someday I'll be boss, ruling over the whole bunch of you. The old man shook his head sadly and said, the gunpowder will come. Nothing can stop it. The same old story over and over. Man will increase and men will fight. The gunpowder will enable men to kill millions of men, and in this way only, by fire and blood, will a new civilization in some remote day be evolved. And of what profit will it be? Just as the old civilization passed, so will the new. It may take 50,000 years to build, but nevertheless it will pass. All things pass. Only remain cosmic force and matter, ever in flux, ever acting and reacting, and realizing the eternal types, the priest, the soldier, and the king. Out of the mouths of babes comes the wisdom of the ages. Some will fight, some will rule, some will pray, and all the rest will toil and suffer sore, while on their bleeding carcasses is reared again and yet again, without end, the amazing beauty and surpassing wonder of the civilized state. It were just as well that I destroyed those cave-stored books. Whether they remain or perish, all their old truths will be discovered, their old lies lived and handed down. What is the profit? Harelip leaped to his feet. giving a quick glance at the pasturing goats in the afternoon sun. Gee, he muttered to Edwin, the old geezer gets more long-winded every day. Let's pull for camp. While the other two, aided by the dogs, assembled the goats and started them for the trail through the forest, Edwin stayed by the old man and guided him in the same direction. When they reached the old right-of-way, Edwin stopped suddenly and looked back. Harelip and Hoo-Hoo and the dogs and the goats passed on. Edwin was looking at a small herd of wild horses, which had come down on the hard sand. There were at least 20 of them, young colts and yearlings and mares, led by a beautiful stallion which stood in the foam at the edge of the surf, with arched neck and bright wild eyes, sniffing the salt air from off the sea. What is it? Grancer queried. Horses, was the answer. First time I've ever seen 'em on the beach. It's the mountain lions getting thicker and thicker and driving 'em down. The low sun shot red shafts of light, fan-shaped, up from a cloud-tumbled horizon, and close at hand, in the white waste of shore-lashed waters, the sea lions, bellowing their old primeval chant, hauled up out of the sea on the black rocks and fought and courted. Come on, Grancer, Edwin prompted, and old man and boy, skin-clad and barbaric, turned and went along the right-of-way into the forest in the wake of the goats. So there you see, it's marked out an hour and 5 minutes it's taken me to read that little bit. Arr, by the light of the Capuchin Sundial. And there we see, on the last bearing, before the sun went behind a pretty fair cloud, that's how, with a Capuchin Sundial and an Azimuth arc on its mounting base, one can indeed tell the time accurately, even around midday, from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. By the time anybody ever wants to bug out, it's too late to be worth bugging out. The idea is to head for the hills before civilization falls. That way you've got less distance to fall. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. The Scarlet Plague, written in 1913. People wonder why I live up here as I do. Ciao.